Hello, I'm Tony Foster. I'm the founder and CEO of Marine Capital. And this is my London talk for London International Shipping Week. What I'm going to do today is take you on a little journey with me. It's the journey, in abbreviated form, you'll be glad to know, of my career in the shipping industry, which has encompassed everything from shipbroking to ship owning, ship management, investment management, and tell you about some of the things I've learned along the way. I've been in the shipping business all my working life. I studied law at university, but didn't go on to practice. And in fact, within 2 weeks of final exams, I was training as a shipbroker in London. Every day I walked to the Baltic Exchange, as London brokers did in those days. That's where the business was transacted, and it was most of the business in the world. Asian chartering markets, such as we now have in Singapore or Shanghai, didn't exist. Business was transacted face to face. It was before mobile phones, before email, needless to say, indeed, before fax. Owners and charterers exchanged information verbally. Junior staff handed out copies of their tonnage lists if they represented owners, or their cargo lists if they represented charterers, which were printed on mimeograph machines. And I suspect you'd probably have to look up what a mimeograph machine is. My boss's phone in the office had an extra earpiece. I could sit by him and listen to his calls with clients. And that was how I initially learned the trade. Shipping firms employed telex operators to type up charter parties and all other documents, as this was the only way to send contracts internationally with any speed. I had an opportunity to work with a client of the firm in the Far East, so I moved very quickly there within 6 months of starting work. And I stayed for 13 years with stints in Manila, Hong Kong, and Tokyo. I think I was very fortunate to have those years in Asia. Brokers in London were obliged to work with a narrow focus. For example, not just in chartering, but in a single sector like dry cargo, then a subsector like handysize. So they developed a great deal of practical knowledge, but in a limited environment. In the Far East, which was much more relationship oriented, you had the opportunity to develop really whatever business the client needed done, irrespective of sector or assets, once you had his trust. I say his because in all those years, I never once had a female client. Fortunately, things are rather different now. Where London brokers were stuck in those narrow specialisms, I was within months chartering all kinds of ships, VLCCs, Panamax bulk carriers, doing sale and purchase, both for trading and demolition, dealing with multiple nationalities, and developing a knowledge of finance, and starting to see myself as an adjunct to the client's management team. There's no substitute really for this kind of experience. Knowing your way around all kinds of charter and sale documents, how ships actually trade, how companies are funded, how parties come together in the industry and where they fall apart. These are the first set of tools really in a business which is entirely contractual. And my legal training became very handy in that respect. The cultural differences between East and West were, as I've suggested, immediately apparent. Business was done after painstaking relationship building, much of it outside office hours. My first major client started working with me after I had spent 2 years speaking with him on every working day. Badgering him perhaps would be a better description. He said that if I was that determined to win his support, he was going to give me a try, as it would probably be to his benefit to have me on the team. I think it was Thomas Edison who was supposed to have said that success is 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. And I was a great believer in that maxim. After those 2 years, I handled all that client's business for several years later. It was a Chinese family business, and the founder had been the biggest buyer of US Army surplus after the Second World War. And one of the job lots he'd bought had included a domestic shipping fleet. That was how he got into shipping, like many of us, by accident. Another client was the world's largest exporter of copra. And copra are the coconut husks before plants were built in the Far East to process these husks for coconut oil as is now exported. This client spoke very few words of English, but we chartered ships every month. And the only words he ever uttered to me, actually more like a grunt in English, were about the laycan and the freight, priced in cents per cubic feet. On one disastrous voyage, the voyages were nearly always from the Philippines to Rotterdam. 2 stevedores who'd been fighting at the load port were unfortunately found dead in a cargo hold at the discharge port. In Hong Kong, the ship owners I dealt with were highly entrepreneurial. And in those days, the world's 2 largest ship owners were both in Hong Kong, CY Tung and YK Pao. I moved from Hong Kong to Tokyo because I wanted to gain experience working with the biggest of all ship owners, the major Japanese companies. These companies own and operate as many as 1,000 ships each, and generally maintain a long-term perspective on their investments, lower risk, lower return, with long tenor freight contracts. They demonstrate some of the attributes which I later appreciated as an investment manager. In other words, attributes which are important to institutional investors. When I eventually returned to the UK, I endeavored to fulfill the role of intermediary between East and West, providing service for the Asian clients who trusted me and linking them to Western companies with whom they wanted to transact. The immediacy of contact we now have with almost anyone, anywhere in the market wasn't true then. I remember one contract for new buildings, which I'd arranged. I traveled to the Far East for the delivery ceremony of the first ship, but my luggage didn't arrive. My hosts kindly took me to the nearest department store to buy clothes for the ceremony, but there weren't clothes big enough to fit me. You could see me in the celebration photo looking like the guy in the straitjacket. So while this was a successful enterprise, my business partners and I were starting to think about a role change, the key one of becoming principals rather than intermediaries. And this was, if you like, the second major learning phase in my career. We knew we had to develop relationships with lending banks, and to win their support, we had to develop and offer a more rounded in-house set of skills, including in-house technical knowledge. Put simply, if we wanted to play the role of a ship owner, we had to look like a ship owner. Successful business development is always about knowing what the client or counterparty wants and providing it, while securing your revenue and hopefully making a profit. And we learned how to help banks with problem loans, which was a vital entry point, given that we weren't capitalized to make investments with our own money. This opened the door for us to become ship owners. My personal journey went on from there via involvement in an IPO in Hong Kong of a company called Pacific Basin, where I was one of the founder directors, to then founding Marine Capital in November 2003. It's hard to believe that MCL, as we call it, is nearly 20 years old. This was the beginning of stage 3 in my own career development. And despite being already a seasoned shipping executive, I found out I still had a lot to learn. I'd already done some foundation work in managing assets for third parties, and my light bulb moment came on reading a document called the Miners Report. This report, commissioned by the UK government, encouraged institutional investors to diversify portfolios away from listed companies and to consider more private investments and more alternative assets. Shipping, as you all know, is an alternative asset class par excellence. So I believe that institutional investors would welcome us with open arms. Here's where my road became steeply uphill. My previous work had been with investors who had some shipping knowledge, not a lot, but enough to make the presentation of the investment case and the business plan relatively straightforward. I was now venturing out to meet investors who had little or no knowledge of the industry. Furthermore, these were real institutional investors, people who spoke a language of Sharpe and Sortino ratios, who bathed in correlation data, and, as I realized, often spent much of their time fending off investment managers like me, who had what they thought was an interesting proposition. Shipping as an investment asset class was new to almost everyone we met. What people thought they knew about shipping was probably negative, often based on hearing about the Baltic Dry Index and its volatility, which volatility, that is, often a dirty word with investors, at least when it comes to shipping. At this stage, perhaps I should point out that institutional investors are pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, foundations, and insurance companies, which are distinct from private equity firms or hedge funds, which are what the shipping community often refers to when it's talking about institutional investors. The latter, like us, try to raise capital from institutions and manage it for them. Many people in shipping still misunderstand what's meant by institutional capital. Having brought in to marine capital colleagues who came from the investment management world, and having myself learnt to use investor language rather than shipping language, a very important distinction, we embarked on a long process of informing and educating our audience. For them, shipping's considered a niche strategy. Sometimes that word grates with shipping people when they hear it, given what we know of the scale of the business. But they mean niche in terms of where it might fit in their respective portfolios. Where shipping professionals get very excited about market opportunities, for example, a market's depressed like tankers today and maybe is going to soar, institutional investors take cover because they just don't appreciate or easily understand shipping market risk. Having to take market risk means not having control of your destiny. Whether or not they have control in other areas of their business is a moot point. The combination of a general lack of knowledge of the industry and a perception of high market risk renders propositions which we might think obvious unworkable at the outset. We have to explain to potential shipping partners that however compelling their arguments may be, these will not obviously bring them institutional capital. Apart from being risk averse, you also have to think of the internal reputation of the manager. Why should the team members invest in a new asset class as a first timer when they can do more of stuff they already have in their portfolios? If this all sounds rather negative, it's not meant to. It wasn't long ago that institutional investors discovered infrastructure as an asset class. Now they have trillions of dollars invested in infrastructure, over $100 billion in 2020 alone. And many of the qualities that they found attractive in infrastructure can be found in the marine market. You just have to know where to look. Knowing how to explain the risk profile in investor language, highlighting the similarities of what they already know, and having solid risk management processes, giving comfort in the areas where they are less comfortable, that's the starting point. Apart from the investment characteristics of shipping as an asset class and how it can be suitable for an institutional portfolio, we have to address the ESG question fully. Without blowing our own trumpet too much, we saw the ESG train coming, I think, long before other shipping market professionals. We knew from the institutional investors we talked to that this was a much bigger topic than just GHG emissions. enormous though that topic is. Like many of you, no doubt, we've watched plenty of dull industry panels where ship owners talk about efficiency improvements and how they are more or less on top of this. Many of them, to us at least, seem to be unaware that they are still fiddling around the edges and that this particular train is going to hit them. We knew from our dealings with some of the world's largest pension funds that ESG was coming higher and higher up the agenda. Several years ago, it had to be addressed in every presentation. Apart from any kind of moral stance, we knew that the pension funds would tighten their criteria for acceptability on ESG grounds, even if ESG meant different things to different investors. We'd already had the experience of receiving from one of our own investors, via their consultants, a long ESG questionnaire, most of whose questions we couldn't answer. So we had to put NA, not applicable. The consultant didn't anticipate that shipping would be in the portfolio of that pension fund. And so the questions couldn't be applied to us. That wasn't a good outcome because if NA means a 0 score, the objective of that pension fund was to weed out the investments with the lowest scores. So that's one reason why, and pretty obvious reason why we've tried to stay at the forefront of the industry debate on ESG. It is and will remain a matter of self-preservation for all of us. Believe me, all of us. Unfortunately, shipping doesn't tell its story very well. When it comes to ESG, it's more important than ever that we as an industry explain clearly what we're doing, what the challenges are, and how we're addressing them. I can't stress this highly enough. We have to change the narrative. Shipping remains more of a privately owned business, especially in Europe, where highly entrepreneurial individuals reign supreme. And many of these wish to keep their activities, for the most part, very confidential. Sometimes it's obviously because these individuals operate in jurisdictions where they wish to avoid personal tax scrutiny. I would say that the wind is blowing against these individuals and their business models. While the more obvious discussions around the environmental impacts of shipping and GHG reduction continues, at MCL we also put particular emphasis on governance. This is an aspect of the industry which gets much less coverage, but will remain critically important if we're going to attract the institutional capital which everyone in the market says it needs. It's widely understood that governance standards have been poor in numerous listed shipping entities, and perhaps also that for some institutions, this gives shipping a bad name. But it's less understood that standards could be much improved generally, including in the private sphere. Too much business is being transacted, for example, by major energy companies with ship owners whose bona fides are not fully tested. Why is this? The answer is that the equity is priced very cheaply, cheaper than the equity which institutional investors are prepared to make available for similar business. The market talks about needing institutional capital, particularly now as we go through the energy transition, but in practice, prices it out. And you have to ask yourself how and why this happens and what might be done about it. It's too cozy an arrangement, in our view, compounded by the fact that these ship owners are able to borrow from major banks in some cases, who may justify their own lack of due diligence by support for the energy client. The energy transition is undoubtedly the opportunity of our lifetimes. It's going to have many consequences for the way shipping markets operate, and there are many predictions being published. Does digital transformation, for example, mean that shipping becomes effectively a utility? Will debt constraints lead to increasing consolidation? How will carbon pricing and/or fuel taxes affect ship owners? Can we solve the split incentive problem? Is the future secure for offshore registries and onshore tonnage tax regimes for that matter? All of these are major challenges, but they also point to opportunity. Institutional capital should play a significant role going forwards. But my appeal today is that we have to up our game. Compliance is not sufficient. Hiding behind the regulator, in other words, taking a passive stance and waiting for the IMO to legislate, will not give comfort to institutional investors, just as lack of transparency, missed price capital, and a culture of compliance, following and not leading in the energy transition, these are all red flags to investors. Shipping has a good story to tell. Freight is cheap, safety is paramount, efficiency levels can be shown to be very high. Seafarers are generally well paid and well treated, despite all the negative press which we've all seen. But we have to get the good news stories out there and not just the sensational ones, which are usually the bad ones. Let's take the opportunity to highlight the widespread professionalism, commercial, technical, and operational, which underpins our daily lives in this industry. We have to be proactive on all aspects of ESG, which will have to include greater transparency and better governance standards than we have now, but we can get there. So if you're watching this talk and you've just started out on your journey, I think you've come to the right place. The potential fulfillment is great. Thank you very much.